Hi, everybody. I'm Arkush for the Chicago Sun-Times and ChicagoSunTimes.com. And we know that you're all excited already about Fantasy Football 2014. But with 4 preseason games still to be played for everybody, it's hard to know what final rosters are going to look like. We all know who the top players are at each position, but putting teams together has to wait for a couple more weeks before we see what depth charts around the league look like. But what you can get ready for right now is draft strategy. How do you want to think about putting your team together? You start with the quarterbacks, and everybody knows that the top fantasy quarterbacks in the NFL usually start with Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Peyton Manning. It's not that different from the best players at the position. But where do you pick your quarterback? For years, the school of thought was you've got to get your running backs first. You can get a quarterback in the 4th, 5th, 6th round. Now, that's still true. There are quarterbacks who put up a lot of fantasy points, guys like a Tony Romo. Matt Ryan is another one who comes to mind. Even a Phillip Rivers or a Carson Palmer. They may not necessarily be with winning teams, but they're not going to be that far behind Brees and Rodgers and Manning in terms of piling up fantasy points. What you have to realize, though, is that in recent seasons, it's been a quarterback, usually Drew Brees, who has been the top point getter in all of fantasy football. You weigh that against the run that there will be on running backs at the beginning of the first round in your league, and can you get a good running back, actually 2 good running backs with your 2nd or 3rd picks, if you in fact take a quarterback first. Now, the best running backs this year, Jamal Charles is going to come off the board first in a lot of leagues. Other leagues you'll see either Shady McCoy or Matt Forte come off. There's always Adrian Peterson. He's still probably the best running back in football, but he slowed a little bit last year after being so dynamic in 2012. And the other thing to keep in mind about Adrian Peterson is he will not catch as many passes as the first 3. Jamal Charles, Shady McCoy, Matt Forte, they are also principal receivers in their offenses, whereas Adrian Peterson, more a pure running back. What do you do at the wide receiver position? Again, there's guys at the top. Calvin Johnson, Megatron is the one that comes to mind immediately. 2 of them in Chicago with Brandon Marshall and Alshon Jeffrey. You've got A.J. Green in Cincinnati. Andre Johnson now finally back with the Houston Texans. The 2 great wideouts in Atlanta are healthy again when you look at Roddy White and Julio Jones. The reality is in most leagues, a top wide receiver will score as many points for you as a top running back. And if you're in a PPR league, which is a points per reception league, then you have to put a priority on drafting your wide receivers high. At the end of the day, though, fantasy football remains pretty much like it was a few years ago. Because of the run that you will have when the drafting starts in your league, your first 3 picks have to include at least 1, preferably 2 running backs. You probably can get a decent quarterback in the 4th, 5th round, so it would not be surprising if many draft boards look like 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers before you think about taking that quarterback. A couple other strategy things to keep in mind. Don't be the guy who jumps on a defense first. You're probably going to be in a 14 or 16 round draft. Invariably, somebody pops up in the 7th or 8th round and says, I want the Seahawks or I want the 49ers. Those defenses are not going to give you enough points to make up for what you could get if you took your 3rd or 4th receiver or running back in those spots. You can get a quality defense in the last couple rounds. Same thing with place kickers. Somebody always pops up in the 8th or 9th round and drafts the place kicker just to get the best one off the board. There's going to be a half a dozen place kickers at the top of every fantasy list who are similar in points. So don't overdraft the extra positions. At the end of the day, fantasy football differs from the NFL and the real thing in one way every year, and that is the running backs are still king. You can't win without a quarterback in the NFL. You can't win without a couple good running backs when you're playing fantasy football. We're going to bring you the best in fantasy information week in and week out right here at the ChicagoSunTimes.com. So stay with us 24/7 as we get closer to the season. We'll have our mock drafts and our top player list coming up for you next.